Welcome to the Sporting Spotlight, Bazz. Good to see you here, mate. Of course, Air Diffusion Australia, big sponsor of ours on the Sporting Spotlight. If you need anything,
I wouldn't have picked it.
anything at all, mate, get Air Diffusion Australia.
Great
Give them a call.
great people.
They'll look
mate.
after you. They do great deals. Best air conditioning in Australia, without doubt, mate.
Clearly.
Yep.
Clearly.
Yep, they are.
Yep.
Hey, just quickly, mate, share, like, follow, subscribe.
That's what they say.
Is that all the things that the
mate,
listeners, if they like it, they need to do? Because I know you'd be across this, because you're the guru.
Yeah, I'm right across it. I'm well across it. But it does help the channel. If people do like and share, if they like what we're doing, like, share, subscribe, boom, and we're away. Because we've had some great interviews so far, mate, and there's a lot more to come. And we're going to talk a lot of sport.
If we can get some good people to do the interviews, they'll be outstanding.
Exactly right.
Because we've got good content.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's good stuff. Join us on the Sporting Spotlight.
Well, we're back, Bez. Of course, the Sporting Spotlight, Air Diffusion Australia, great sponsors of ours. And do you reckon they'd be getting smashed in the last few weeks with summer here, mate?
Yeah, the air conditioning,
I
mate,
gave them
yeah.
a call. I need to come around quick, boys. The air conditioner's not going as good as it should.
No, mine's working beautifully.
Is it? Yeah, well, I bought mine from the wrong place initially.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Now I'm humming.
Look after the sponsor.
Well, mate, you know we want to get the big guest. None bigger than our next guest, mate.
Yep.
304 games for the Norwood Footy Club, 28 games at Fitzroy, but probably more important than all of that, saved your club, the Port
Saved
Adelaide.
my club.
Well, mate, he came in 2011.
Yes, he did.
And at that stage, mate, the word was, and I don't want to embarrass him, he'll be humble about it, but they were a basket case. The AFL were even saying, don't know if we can keep him in.
Yeah, well.
10 years later, he's gone, well, I can do everything I've done. The
According
Tups
to
are
who?
gone with a quick
According
crowd,
to
mate.
who?
I'm just repeating what the
They will
media
never
said at
die.
the time, mate.
They will never die, mate.
Our special guest, Keith Tollancy, joined us. Keith, great to see you, mate.
What an intro.
What an intro.
Did I lie about any of it, mate?
No, I love that. So
And
I'm going to take that.
Take it.
Take it
Oh, hang
every
on, I
day.
missed out the 5 state games as well, mate. I missed that out as well.
And we're here at
Norwood.
At Norwood as well, mate. Make you feel comfortable. Just being here at Norwood.
You've done a great job. It
you're
looks
playing.
fantastic.
Doesn't it
actually.
look great? Doesn't it look great?
They've done
Yeah,
a
it
tremendous
does.
job. I think the gather round, has really helped. Put a sparkle back at the parade. It's
Well, I've not
it's good to
seen
be here.
I've not seen the parade look as good as this.
me neither.
Ever in my entire time. Because we used to travel here. The Port supporters travelled to Norwood. No problem at all. It was one of our great travelling days to watch Port and Norwood. Well, it was, mate. I mean, the rivalry. I don't know whether there's a rivalry. There probably is. Your Collingwood, Essendon, whatever. But Port Norwood was, for me, and Keith, you played in the games. You were there. Is one of the great rivalries of football, in my opinion. It was just so massive in front of every supporter of Port Adelaide and Norwood. Norwood loved playing us. We loved playing Norwood. We didn't really like it, but we followed it.
Well, my history, is a little bit more tangled. It's quite interesting how it's played out in my professional life. But I grew up being a Port Adelaide supporter as a kid. Like at school, my dad was born and bred in Brompton, and when I was playing footy as an 11-year-old, he was thinking about, can we shift house to get us into the Port zone, right? Because he knew that we were locked into the Norwood space. So that was happening as a kid, and then I got into the Norwood system and had my first experience at Port Adelaide, as an under-17, walking down that little grandstand with the wire and getting spat on by the kids at the top of the grandstand.
And I apologise for that. If I'd known it was you, I wouldn't have done it.
No. What the message that sent to me was, boy,
wow,
they're serious here. Like, this is under 17s, right?
Yeah.
And so from that moment on, you're into the rivalry.
Felt it,
I've always had a really positive feeling about that Port Norwood rivalry, because I compare it with the Crows and Port Adelaide, which I think is a bit toxic at times. Like it's
yes, it is.
There's an edge to it which I don't like. Whereas the Port Norwood one is all about respect.
It's all about respect.
150 years of competing against each other in the big moments. And the feeling that as a Nord player we had was we don't know how this is going to go. We always thought we could win it, but you never knew. And I think Port Adelaide felt the same way about
Exactly
Norwood.
the same way.
So,
Yeah.
you know, that made for a fantastic rivalry,
brilliant,
and for me, all of the important games that I remember in my career were against Port.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and the same would go with crowds. You would play against, a couple of thousand at Noarlunga one week, but then you're up at 16 to 20,000 the following week at Alberton.
Yeah, no, we had.
And it's massive.
We had 20,000 in this one particular year. I can't even remember the year it was, but we played Port here at Norwood.
Yeah.
20,000 here.
That's right.
Right, they're up.
Right.
They're in that tree.
They were everywhere.
And
they were, yeah.
And it was Greg Phillips and Jimmy Teal, and then we went to Alberton. 22,000 there, and it was a fantastic era of footy.
It was a bit like you couldn't sleep the night before a Port Norwood game, and I mean that. I mean not, and I mean I'm not playing.
Yeah.
But I've got to go to Norwood tomorrow. For a start, I need to wear my sunnies and a hat because they'll kill me out here somewhere if they spot me.
Yeah.
But every Port supporter felt the same way. But it didn't stop them going, and it didn't stop Norwood supporters from going to Alberton. They went there.
They did. When we played at Alberton, they were very smart. The Port crew. They'd park us in a spot which meant we had to walk through the Port Adelaide cheer squad.
Exactly.
To come into the ground.
Yes,
right?
that's right. Fair enough.
So you got a fair warm up, an hour before the game.
There's always myths in sport. There was always the talk of you got to drive past the Cheltenham Cemetery. Yes. Did that ever get raised by?
Oh, it was always part of it, and it was really about creating this aura about going down there, and it was real. Now I would like to think that Port felt the same way having to come here against the brick wall of Norwood, right?
Mate, absolutely.
There was a sense of anticipation that you were going to battle, and it was always the same. And then you're in that Western Grandstand area, and you're getting slagged there, and and you come to Norwood and you're getting slagged here, and oh man, a lot of emotion.
Yeah. I'm listening to you talk though, and you can see that the enjoyment we're coming out of you, mate. It's like I'm going back into this space that was great.
Yes.
Best and fairest, 3 runner-ups for best and fairest with Norwood. And I know Bazz would like to talk about Port Adelaide, but I'd just like to come back to Norwood for a little bit, mate, because we'll get to Port in a minute with you. Some of the great players that you enjoyed playing with, mate. Who would be your top 3 or 4?
Terrific players.
Well, I feel as if I was incredibly fortunate to play in an era where we had some of the greatest players to ever play for Norwood.
Absolutely.
In our team. There was Michael Taylor, Michael Aish, and Gary McIntosh. And if you had to pick 3 of the 4 best ever, Walt Scott is the other one. He was a bit before our time, but those 3 were in the midfield when I was there, and so I'm thinking, wow,
exactly.
That's pretty special stuff. And
exactly.
And they were an incredible group to play with. I often get asked, who were the best players that you played with, and they're always the guys that could turn a game when the moment demanded it. Now, that sounds like a simple thing to say, but it's very, very hard. Because you've got to have the talent. 2, you've got to have the mindset to be able to say, I'm going to do this.
Switch on,
And those 3 were players that I played with that could do that. When I was in Melbourne, it was Paul Roos and it was Gary Purd and those sort of guys. But I stood a Robbie Flower in a state game here, and he's gone, okay, well, game's got to be won here, turns it on. I was standing him, and I just got a bath. So that's special, and and you don't really play with many of those guys. But it just so happened that in Norwood's history, they were all here at that moment.
And that's a great midfield. When you look at that midfield, yourself and Michael Taylor, Michael Aish, Gary McIntosh, mate, that is as good as you're going to see. And when you put it up against the Port midfield of the time with Russell Ebert and Clifford and all these guys, mate, that's football worth paying the money to go and have a look at, to me. Well, and that's why we always went to Port Norwood games, because no matter where you were, bottom, doesn't matter.
No.
It was going to be on.
Well, I remember the 1980 season was when I essentially started. I had a couple of shots at it in '79. There's a story in that, but 1980 was my first full year, and that Port Adelaide side was, I think, the best side that I ever played against.
Which Russell Ebert says is the best side that he's ever played in.
Yeah,
No
so
doubt.
they were 10 goals ahead of the competition. Now, the 83 West Adelaide side was a very good side as well.
Yeah.
But that 80 side, and we ran them right to the line
Yeah.
in the grand final, which was and we'd come from 5th that year
That's
as
right,
well. So,
yes.
but that year was was very special. Then in '84, when we took it, we'd come from 5th, but it was back earlier in the year when we had to beat Port Adelaide, to start the ball rolling, So when I was talking about all of these games that are crucial in my memory, they somehow they're
Port games.
They're Port games,
Yeah.
and and I treasure all of that.
Well, people won't forget the mark you took in that game in 1984. The year you won, came from 5th, running the wrong way, running backwards with the flight of the ball, and could have got killed. People were wishing you did get killed.
They won't forget it, Bazz, because every time I'd go into the Port Club when I worked there, they had this that stuff going, and they were furious about it. Like that.
Why didn't someone clean him up?
Yeah, like poor old Brent Owens or whoever it was. And I'm thankful to this day that it wasn't Stevie Curtis, because it would have been a different outcome if he'd been in position, as he should have been.
That's what I mean.
It would have been that would have been a bad outcome.
But it's folklore in Norwood history. But that year, the 1984, when you came from 5th, that's in Norwood folklore. That is, and that mark stands out as.
part of the folklore,
what do you
isn't it?
call it? It's just part
Magic
of the folklore.
moment,
Yeah,
mate.
magic
It's the
moment in
magic
that game. It was just
Yeah.
it was, and like you said, that was a really good side too. Norwood side in '84 was
Better than it was playing.
Just a great side. Yeah,
we
just
started
a
off
great
really badly. I
Yeah.
think we were
All
we were
over the shop,
bottom
yeah.
after 9 rounds, right?
Yeah.
So we had a lot of injuries. But we had to win 10 of the last 11 games to make the finals, right? So by then, you were in really good nick, but under the radar because you weren't considered a threat.
Yeah.
But we were playing really well, and so and we were coming in with a lot of confidence that we could come
Absolutely,
from anywhere. We'd beaten the Eagles. We were 7 goals down at 3/4 time, and it was raining, having to win to keep the
Momentum
finals
going,
open.
push, yeah.
And we beat them. We beat them by 2 goals. So those sorts of things were going on in that year that I think are a big part of the story.
Yeah.
That the grand final was a fitting end to an incredible sort of story for Norwood.
Would have been a nice party too.
It was a good one. And but the year had contained so many moments where it could have all just disappeared.
Yeah, exactly.
A couple of years at Fitzroy, mate. You mentioned Roosie before and Flower. Some of the blokes that you play against. There's always that talk going from South Australia to Victoria. You had to just be a little bit better, to get the nod.
Yeah.
And you were good at it, mate. You had 2 good years there. Who do you reckon were some of the names when you went there that surprised you? How you go, he's good, but I can see why now. He's a lot better than I thought he was.
Well, I was really surprised at the gap. By the time I got there, I was 24. I had been playing state footy, had a couple of premierships, and felt like I was ready to go.
Yep.
Yeah.
I got there in October and saw the standard, the physical standard that Fitzroy were delivering on the track, and I was absolutely shell-shocked. And I thought, whoa, I'm a mile... as an athlete, I'm a mile behind, and I don't have enough time. That's where my head went. The competitiveness on the training track, because they didn't care. I was the big name recruit coming in, and I was a person that they had to get out of the way. And so every training session was, run them into the ground, beat them up. It was a battle every single day. And so fast forward to the games, and I remember playing a fella. You talk about being the best players. I stood a guy called Adrian Gleeson, right? Now he's a journeyman, right? Good player.
Yes, he was a journeyman.
But not at the top rail, right?
Yeah.
He picked me up at Princess Park and ran me for 7 minutes in the first 7 minutes of the game, and I was cramping up, hammies and calf, both legs. I never cramped, right? Yeah. Prided myself on fitness. He had me cramping up in both legs in 7 minutes. He had decided, I'm going to find out whether you can go or not.
Yeah.
Physically.
Yeah.
And I couldn't.
Yeah.
And so that was the lesson that I was learning really early on. Yeah. And I reflect on those 2 years and say, well, I probably learned more in that 2 years about resilience. How do you overcome problems? You know, because my mindset approach was work harder. What happened was because I was overreacting to the gap that I could see, I worked harder. Yeah. So then I got an iron deficiency. So my body was completely depleted. I had no energy. I didn't know they didn't have the sports science then as they do now. They would have. But they found out too late. So I was standing in the middle of the MCG, and all I could see was bright green. I was completely blind. Yeah. Like I couldn't see because of this iron deficiency. And so I had to learn that it's not about working harder. You got to actually think about how am I going to get better in this. And that's what the 2 years was about. And in the end, like I left because David Parkin got the flick, and I didn't see any real future finals activity for Fitzroy. But the learnings from that period were
Isn't it funny,
incredible.
Keith? Because you were well known for your training, work ethic, preparation at Norwood. Yeah. You were well known for that. So then you go boom over there, and it's another world.
That was the shock, right? So I don't think that. I never considered myself a great player, but I did consider myself a very disciplined trainer. Like I always felt like I'm never going to leave anything to chance. And yet there was another level. And isn't that a fantastic life experience?
Amazing.
The lesson I took was never assume that you know it all. You just don't. You just walk around the corner and there's someone else doing it better. Okay.
True,
you got to find
that.
Mate,
you mentioned David Parkin.
Yes.
I love Parker. I'm a big fan. A bloke who's so articulate, lecturer at university, yet could flick the switch, mate, and be angry in a moment. Were you surprised by that?
I was surprised. Because he was the reason I went.
Yep.
I was so impressed with him, and the professionalism that he brought to Fitzroy was fantastic. But he had white line fever, right? There was this game, right? So this is a true story, right? So we're playing Brisbane. I'm on the bench, and I can hear him. He's up in the grandstand, yelling to the trainer, to the runner, "Get Thomas off! He's done nothing!" Right? And the trainers looked at me and said, "Can you stand up and wave to Parko? I wasn't even on the ground, right?" And he's blaming me for what was going on. So I'm waving to Parko. I'm here. So he had a few anger management issues, but a very smart guy. I get on really well with him. I learned a lot, but there was an intensity about him.
Huge fan about Parker. I mean, we need to get to Port Adelaide. You arrive in 2011.
Yes.
I guess my first question is, you knew going in the wall that was against you was like a tsunami that had been building, and you're in the footy world, so you got enough intel, questions asked. What made you take the challenge? Because it was a massive challenge.
Yeah, so I was excited by the opportunity immediately. The question I had to answer was, would the Port Adelaide community trust me enough to institute the changes that I knew had to be made? I didn't know what the problems were, but I just knew that there were deep problems. There had to be, because no club performs like it was performing on field unless there's a lot going on behind. So I knew that I would be a change agent, but if you're going to get people to follow you got to be worth following, and they got to trust that, right? And I wasn't convinced that I could do it, that I could convince them. We went through the interview process, and I remember asking Bruce Abernethy, who was on the selection committee, and I said to Bruce, who I'd stood in the 80 grand final, I said, Bruce, do you reckon this has got any chance whatsoever of success? Like me, Norwood guy, coming in to this environment.
That's a fair question.
He said, there's not a chance in hell. There's not a chance in hell. And I said, you know what? I agree with you. And we walked away thinking, okay, well, that's too hard. Brett Duncanson hung in there a bit longer. He thought that there was a chance, and as it turned out, I convinced myself that, all right, Port Adelaide people want to win. They're going to embrace anyone that they think can help them do that. If you just stay true to that, it might take a while, but you might have a chance. And so I decided to take it on. But it's got to be felt like I had a few months I was watching a lot of games, and I was staggered at what I was looking at, because it just wasn't the Port Adelaide that I knew.
Exactly right.
And I by the time I got there, I was keen to really understand it. And
what did you see when you said it wasn't the Port Adelaide that you knew? What was the?
I saw a lack of cohesion. I think I saw games where. The one we lost to Gold Coast, first time Gold Coast had ever beaten anyone, and we lost that, and we were well up, and we lost. And I saw efforts that were inconsistent with
very inconsistent
Port Adelaide. When you're hardwired Port, you go, this is not right.
Hang on,
it's not right. And I saw division. I saw division and heard it, and I didn't understand where it was coming from. Actually, there was a game that was played against Melbourne at Adelaide Oval. It was a prelude to what was going to happen in 2014,
yes,
right?
I remember the game well.
Yep, and we were training at Adelaide Oval just before that game, and there was a guy standing up on a hill, Port Adelaide supporter. And I just wandered up, and at this stage I was incognito. No one knew, that I was, gonna take it. And I said to him, "Can just talk to me about your relationship with Paul. What are you looking at here? What are you seeing? And how do you see the Magpies and the power?" And he said, and I'll never forget this because it actually shaped the way that my mindset as I went in, and Bazz was able to reinforce it for me. He said, "I barrack for the Power. I know they're Port Adelaide, but my heart is with the Magpies. I love the Magpies, and I don't think my club's treating them well." And that was a really interesting. I'd never, as a Nord guy, I had no sense of that at all. To me, Port Adelaide's Port Adelaide. But to this guy who was passionate, he was talking about what had happened to the club through regulation, through entry into the AFL, through the effort of getting into the AFL, through financial pressure. The Magpies and the Power had been separated. It had created division in the club, and the Port Adelaide supporter group, who overwhelmingly were Magpie supporters who are now barracking for the Power, in the AFL, didn't like it. They didn't like what was going on with the Magpies, because we were training at Ethelton.
That's right. Kicked out of Albion.
Coming last.
Yeah.
No resources, not treated as Port Adelaide.
Yeah.
And then you had the Power going badly, like at that stage. Now, when the effort of the Power to enter the competition and immediately make an impact, and then climb the mountain, play in a grand final and win it, and play another one and lose it, that 10 years was an unbelievable. I don't know that we've ever quite got the credit for that.
Exactly right.
That group.
That's so true.
That 10 years was incredible, but it took everything the club had.
Yeah.
And I think that by the time I got there, it was completely knackered.
Yeah.
And the repercussions of that build was playing out, in both, throughout the club, and that was the germ of the thought, which was we've got to bring this club back together, and we've got to do it not by being something else, which is what the SANFL agenda was. Port Adelaide can't work. It's got to change.
Yeah.
That was coming through loud and clear. My feeling was, and I think our feeling was collectively, was we've got to go back to what Port Adelaide means, and that means bringing it together.
Yeah.
Bringing it back together. One club, all of our resources. Now, George and Tim had been already on this, from a financial point of view, they'd been driving that agenda. It's Tim Ginniver and George Fiarchi.
Shaking the cans.
They were already in that mind space. But at the regulatory end was probably where, I had to play a role in saying, okay, there was a moment where, we had to convince the Port community that bringing the two programs together was ultimately the only way we could survive.
Yeah.
And the only way we could have both teams competitive.
Yeah.
I
remember that.
Yeah, that was a big moment. That was a big
huge
moment. But thankfully everyone got on board.
It's almost like a relocation, isn't it? Fitzroy relocating. You just separated and try and bring it back.
But,
Is that where the catchphrase "We are one"
came
from?
One club, was always. It's certainly where Never Tear Us Apart came from.
Yes.
Because we felt that through, for reasons other than our own, we had been dragged apart as a club, and by bringing it back together, we felt like that moment at Adelaide Oval, that song said,
yes,
that's never going to happen again.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And so, the Port people got that instantly. They knew that that's what it all meant, and that's why it's been a success. Yes, the one club, was again, George and Tim were ahead of the curve on this one, and they knew that a divided club was never going to work.
Well, we spent days and days and days and days. Every single day, there would be an argument about, I'm Magpies, I'm not Power. It drove me mad for.
Well, and it was
10
happening.
years
It was happening.
ridiculous.
Not only the real danger for Port Adelaide was that division had been created by external forces.
Exactly.
But it had infiltrated internally.
Yeah.
So you had a Power faction and a Magpie faction, and you had people who didn't believe that, because I think the original plan, if you talk to Bolton, Greg Bolton, was the Magpies would naturally end, once the Power came in.
Yeah.
And so that was all clean. But the SNFL
said no.
Because the SNFL, without Port Adelaide in it, was a pretty stark sort of idea. So that meant two entities, and that was the beginning of
the problem.
Right? And so, but that was internal as well, and so we just needed to get realigned, around the values of Port Adelaide.
And we did.
Mate, so you've taken a team that was struggling to very successful in a 10-year period, so it's not an easy journey, and listening to, there's lots of trips.
Yeah.
If you were giving advice to a young CEO, be it a basketball, a netball or a footy club, what's the one gold nugget that you'd say you need to be able to do this?
Well, I think it's really easy. You've got to listen. You have to. Now, I was in a situation where I was an outsider, and one, you've got to have the ability to acknowledge that. You know, you're given a position of influence, but you can't take a position of I know it all. I didn't know anything. So you've got to be prepared to listen, and listen at all levels of the club, not just to the board. I did a lot of listening with our members, with our supporters in the Port Club, with the guys who were helping the club out, the volunteers, everyone. So you could get a sense of the essence. What is it that we want to be, and what's missing, and all of the wisdom came from there. Then then it was about, okay, how do you build a plan to capture that and get people to come along on the journey with you? And so I would say you got to listen. Then, now I reflect on it. I didn't feel like this at the time, but I had a great license because we were so bad. Yeah, no one expected Port Adelaide to recover. The AFL certainly didn't. You know, they were planning for alternatives. And I had no knowledge of that. So the mindset that we created as a group was, let's have a go here. Let's just have a go. Let's get it back to what Port Adelaide stands for. Let's be meaningful to our community. Let's show them something that they can recognise for a start, right? And I'm talking about, let's answer phone calls to our members rather than put them on a answering machine. Remember that?
Yeah, I do remember it really well, don't worry.
Let's answer complaints. Let's treat people with respect. Let's give them information, right? I remember there was a lot of disinformation in the marketplace, right, about Port Adelaide. Everyone was talking about us, right? So I remember going out with the little newsletter. I said, okay, from today on, you can rely on this piece of information, right? I'm going to send it to you regularly, and this will be the truth. Yeah. Now that sounds like a not a big thing, but for a group that was being told by every other person what they should and shouldn't do, and what they, what they should stand for.
I remember it so well because it was a matter of telling the members, and I used to tell them regularly, don't listen to anything at all unless it comes directly from the club. And it became a thing. It became, okay, we don't. Now they look forward to what Keith would put out whenever he did.
Just put it out.
But when, being a Norwood man, you can imagine the pressure
it's huge.
that Keith was under turning up at Albert as the CEO. Because those people that were there that night, that they are hardened Port Adelaide people. They're not the people who just joined the club or anything.
Can you remember your first meeting with Keith, mate? Because you're a bit staunch Port Adelaide. A little bit, just a little bit.
I remember.
Fair to say there's a little bit over there, isn't it? There's a little bit.
Fair bit going on.
Yeah, fair bit.
I remember talking to the members before Keith arrived.
How many in the room?
Oh, it was a packed room. Don't worry about that. It was But I remember talking to them first, saying, "Now, we Keith Thomas is everyone knows Keith Thomas. Keith's going to be here. If you've got questions." I remember looking at the faces and thinking, "Good luck, Keith." but I walked out of the room as Keith walked up the stairs to the top of the stairs, and I'll never forget this because it was the first thing that Keith said to me. The very first thing, he went, "Now, Bazz." That's what now, Bazz. And I remember going, "Now, Keith, hang on, mate. No. There's no drama here, no drama on my end. You've got to go in there. That's where your drama's going to be." But I'll never forget that because the club needed something, and it needed it pretty badly. And Keith delivered. But can you remember that night when you walked into that room and there they are?
Yeah.
And they were just looking at you as if to say, "Mate, what do you got?"
Yeah.
That was
it was and quite right. Yeah. I feel like I do have the ability to listen, and I'm genuinely interested in what I was certainly interested in what the Port Adelaide people had to say, and I always with Bazz and Russell Ebert were the two people. If ever I was going into a room where there was some risk, and that was often, right? Bazz and Russ, because I knew that if I got into trouble, I'd just look over there and they would come in and say something, would just get it back on track, because there was a lot at stake. There was a lot at stake, and people knew that the club was on its knees, and this was this was the person who was going to, hopefully help it a bit.
Was it because Bazz is so physically imposing like Russ was?
Yeah, that's right.
Because Russ was slightly built.
But I remember Keith ringing me on the Monday and saying to me, "Now, Bazz, I know you play golf on Monday, but I need you. And I said, "Well, when do you need me, mate?" Well, you get 5:15 tonight. It was the announcement of the one club. It was where people were really, that was that crowd. And I said, "Oh yeah, what do you want me to do? You want me to, want to MC it or no? Just come along and stand there, stand right there,
Preferably in front of me."
Yeah, because that was the tricky night. That was held in the indoor
in the stadium.
Yeah,
we had
tricky night.
We had security that night,
exactly.
Because the proposition there was that we were going to forego our zones, and that is a very, very big, and I knew it was a very big decision. A lot of history, a lot of love for the dream of coming from the zone into Port Adelaide and playing for Port Adelaide. That was a dream, and we were going to walk away from that, and I felt like it could easily go very badly. But we presented a case logically. We said, look, we're not about being mediocre. We're about winning. And this system's not going to allow us to win. And we've tried it. It hasn't worked. I can't see it working. But I reckon if we did this, we'd have a chance.
Bit of a crack, yeah.
And
we did.
We did.
Mate, we could talk about Port Adelaide and your time there, but you mentioned when I'm listening to you, I was taking your advice, mate. Listen, have a go. It's a really Aussieism, isn't it? Have a go. So, mate, you've moved out of the footy world into something completely different. Have a go. Tell us about that.
Well, I wasn't out of footy very long. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and a mate of mine came over from the States. It was COVID period, so he'd come back to be with his family, and there was a lot of news around concussion at that time, and he said, "What's all this stuff? What's going on?" And I explained that there was Shane Tuck, and there'd been some pretty high profile problems, and I said I know that inside the AFL it's becoming a really big issue, and I know globally the same. And he said, "Well, look, I'm working with a group of scientists for the University of California. They've just come up with this concussion detection device, a detection device for stroke. They trialled it on concussion back in 2015. It worked, but there was no appetite for it in the States, and they just put it in the drawer. Do you think we should bring it out and see whether there's any application?" And that got me into the space. And so since then, I've been doing clinical trials with American universities and companies, looking for technologies that are going to help parents and doctors and sports trainers objectively measure concussion in a practical and easy way. At the moment, if you go to a hospital, you get an MRI, you get a sense of it, but it's not really accurate. Whereas there is technology out there which could sit in a medical kit, mum or dad could put it on the youngster and tell within 2 minutes whether they're concussed or not, and when they're ready to come back in 12, 15, 20 days' time. So, but it's not quite ready. So I've been in that space. But what that's done, and I've deliberately targeted the community level of sport.
We caught up at Port Districts that time.
Port Districts, because that's where the vast majority of the concussions are occurring. We hear about the AFL, but there's 10,000 players playing amateur footy, like in South Australia, right? So there's a lot of concussions going on, very little support, very little medical support, and they're really worried about it. So I've been working with clubs at that level. I'm still there. I'm hoping that at some point, we'll be able to deliver the game, not only detection devices, but treatments. Like that technology is close. We just now need to work our way through all the regulatory stuff that goes along with it. That's happening. But so that's been a completely different sort of experience for me. Very concerning. It's opened my eyes to a problem that I had misjudged, not really taken enough notice of.
But you weren't alone there. I mean,
I think we're all we're all like that.
Yeah.
So, it's concerning.
Yeah.
It's concerning to me, and I know that it's concerning to a lot of parents out there. And the great risk. People talk about the risk of litigation, insurance, and that's real.
Yeah.
But the greater risk is mum and dad saying, you're not playing footy. As an 8-year-old, you're playing basketball or soccer, and we won't even know. Yeah. They're just not playing out the game that we love, right? Yeah. That's real. And because there's so much publicity around the issue, if you're a footy fan, you can't miss it. And what it's saying is, it's dangerous, and you're absolutely within your rights to be asking the club that you play for, how do you handle it?
Yeah.
And that's what the clubs at the local level are faced with. And they're really conscientious. They're trying, but they need more support.
It's a fair challenge, isn't it? It sort of started, I think the AFL have been on it for a little while, but the NFL kind of brought it out in the open, didn't they? More. And medicine's a wonderful thing, how it can quickly get to points. Then it slows, then it gets there.
Yeah.
Are we keeping up with the pressure? We need some solutions. We're close with the medicine. Are we nearly there?
Interesting. It's a great question. So there was a Senate inquiry into concussion in sport in 2022. They made 13 recommendations, and 3 of them were around education, commitment to research to find better solutions, and club support. Fast forward another year from that, and the jury's out as to whether enough energy is going into it. I know a lot of energy is going into rule changes and tinkering with interpretations
Leave it alone.
All that sort of stuff. But I think more practical effort needs to go into how do you help these clubs and hold them accountable to their practices? How do we invest in the right research to deliver practical solutions that people can use, not doctors? My vision for it is mum and dad can feel reassured because they can tell whether there's a problem, and then go and see if the systems miss them. It's all there. It'll happen. I'd like to have it happen faster, but there's also a lot of when you got to get it right. I understand that. There's also a lot of politics, like in this space. There's politics between the medical people and the sports people and, all of those things. I feel it's too big an issue not to get right, so I think we will. But, part of what I think my job is to just keep pushing it along. People like, I'm not the only one, there's people doing this.
Yeah.
Let's just keep presenting better ways to do this and provide support to those who need it.
All right, mate. Fast five, and then we'll get you out of here,
Okay,
mate, so you can go
all
into a bit more. Otherwise, we'll be here all day, mate. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Look out for the fast five.
Fast five, mate. Okay. If you didn't play footy, what would have you done?
I reckon I would have been a journalist.
Yep.
I had a great interest in writing and back through school, but then footy took over, and then I became less interested in a career.
Yeah.
It was more. I'm a little bit like that, but singularly focused. So, and I was just very fortunate that another career, the radio career, came after footy, and that looked after me.
Most admired footballer. Give me two.
Tough one.
Sorry, it can't be the Aish,
No,
Taylor, McIntosh. Outside of Norwood.
See, you've thrown me because you're saying most admired. I admired Russell. As my favourite player, and then as the man that I learned to know. So clearly him.
You'd have a few, Keith. There'd be a few. Well,
I tell you, I'm showing my age here, but the people that were important to me, looking at, were Ebert and Robran. Now, Barry Robran. This is a sign of the greatness of this man. You talk about it being humble, right? I've never heard him say anything about himself and his career and whatever. But he is just a beautiful human being who just happened to be as tough as nails playing.
He was,
He's not credited for that.
No.
He's credited for his abilities. But his humility is what I loved.
Unbelievable.
He's unique.
He's unique. Yeah.
Unbelievable. I did it very quickly, mate. I did a show where Russell and Barry were the guests.
Yeah, wow.
So it was down at a place called Francis, somewhere out of border town somewhere. And they spent an hour talking about each other.
Yeah, yeah.
No, he's better.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, no, he was clearly better than me.
Yes.
Oh, don't be silly, Russell. You were
Yes.
better, you were clearly better than me. That went the whole night. So I know exactly where you come from.
Yeah.
They're great people. What a great player he was.
Russell had that about him. He just had a harder look about him. Barry had a softer look. I think people miss that with Russ, that he was humble as well.
He was very humble. But the thing about Barry was because he had this movement. He was fluid, right?
Like he wasn't moving. Yeah.
But I actually played on the day that he came back from his knee injury, and he had this big thing.
Huge bandage.
And I felt it. He was hard as nails at the contest, and it was. I remember being, ooh, that's a surprise. This is serious business. But no, so they're great men.
If you hadn't gone to Port Adelaide and you could pick any other club to be a CEO at, is there one that would have tempted you?
I knowing what I know now, I would have picked a club that had a cultural identity, something that it stood for something. I think of North Melbourne. I think of the Shinboner sort of aspect to them. I felt like it would need to be a club that had an identity, like that I believed in.
Yeah.
To be honest, there's not a lot that live to that. I never spent a lot of time thinking about that, but it would have been a club like that. I would have been digging in for what are their values, what do they stand for, is it real? Are they genuinely wanting to be that? So then I think you've got something to work with.
Do you like where the game's played now? Do you like the way it's played? Rule changes have come and gone.
Look, I don't love it. I'm a great admirer of the skill it takes to play in congestion like they do.
Yep.
But I have this vision of what footy should look like, what it was designed to look like, which was 360 view of the game. You played it, it was open and fast and physical, which I think was the era that I came through in, and you see patches of it now, but the coaching is so good and the organisation is so good that you can't have that anymore. And so the player has to be even better at the skill execution to get the ball out and get it into the right spot.
Yeah.
You're hitting a target, a forward target now, like a Dan Houston. It's rolled gold because it's so hard. Getting the ball in from a stoppage is incredibly difficult. And so I'm not a lover of the way the game looks, but I'm a great admirer of the way they have to play it. Because you've got to be better to do it.
Good call.
I asked David Parker once how he thought the game had changed. Because you'd had him as a coach, you'll appreciate it. He said, when we had pre-season training, which you would have done with them, we'd come out, we'd run around the grounds, almost until you threw up.
Yes.
Then they'd start the game and we'd go straight down the middle of the ground. Now the athletes come out and they do sprints up and down the ground, and now they go around the ground. It's a fairly simplistic way of putting it, but he's actually quite right. Mate, we could talk to you ever. We really appreciate your time, mate. Great to get your knowledge on the concussion and the time through footy, mate. No, love your passion. It's infectious as we sit here and talk. Keith Thomas, our special guest.
Thank you, guys.
Hey folks, if you enjoyed that, we'd really like you to like, share and subscribe to the channel. It really does help us out a lot.